The next item on the agenda here for the nervous system is to look at how the nerve, the whole nervous system, the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, have their origins, and that's going to relate somehow, in some way, to how the brain forms eventually in the spinal cord, which we'll be looking at. So embryonically, the nervous tissue begins as a flat plate right down the middle of the dorsal portion of the developing embryo. That flat plate is called a neural plate, the neural plate. That neural plate becomes a neural groove. So this is our neural groove stage right here. There's our neural groove. And these little corners out here on the edge we call neural folds. So we had a plate, it's going to fold together, and eventually it's going to come together right here. Right at this corner, let's see, let's put that in purple color here. Right in here where these two folds come up and meet one another, they will eventually result in a different tissue that separates from both the overlying surface, which becomes your epithelium on the middle of your back, right across here. That's the epithelial layer. And of course, this becomes the neural tube, the nervous tissue right there. So between your surface ectoderm, or your epidermis, and your neural tissue down below, there's some tissues that kind of get caught in between. Now you might think that they just disappear or something, but these become a number of different tissue types that are vital to your body function out there. These tissues, these special tissues that result from that coming together of the two folds right there, this is called neural crest tissue. And this is going to be called neural tube. Okay, we're ready to look at the 3 neuromer brain. The neural tube that we just looked at is forming there. Forms from it forms right down the middle of the developing body of the embryo. And early on in its formation, as that neural tube forms, 3 enlargements of the more anterior part of that tube will form. They're called neuromeres. So these are our 3 neuromeres. This is the 3 neuromer brain. The cavity inside here that goes through the middle, the central chamber, we know as the neurocoel. The neurocoel. This front part of the brain right here, in the 3 neuromer brain, is called a prosencephalon. Didn't leave quite enough room to write there. The next segment of the brain right in here, this is the mesencephalon. And then this last part back here is the rhombencephalon. What we know is the adult brain will form from these 3 segments right here, and the remainder of it back here will become spinal cord. So from this prosencephalon, a little later on, we're going to see it divide into 2 parts. The telencephalon and diencephalon. The mesencephalon will remain just this one chamber here, and then the rhombencephalon will divide into 2 chambers, one called the metencephalon, one called the myelencephalon. So next we'll draw the 5 neuromer brain. Okay, here we have the 5 neuromer brain. These first 2 segments right here came from the prosencephalon region. The first one here is the telencephalon. Telencephalon. Notice it looks like it's dividing into 2 parts here. These are going to become your cerebral hemispheres, left and right cerebral hemispheres of the brain and everything that's contained in those cerebral hemispheres. The next segment, also from the original prosencephalon, is diencephalon. Becomes the thalamic region of the brain. The hypothalamus, thalamus, and epithalamus regions of the brain includes the pineal gland that produces melatonin. The hypothalamus has a lot of regulatory functions, including body temperature, thirst centers, and so forth. A lot of different things in the hypothalamus. And then the next section is what we sometimes call midbrain, but it's still called mesencephalon. No division of the mesencephalon. Then finally, the rest of the brain comes from the old rhombencephalon, but it's divided into two segments now. This segment right here, that enlargement, it's called the metencephalon. The cerebellum of the brain comes from the roof portion of the metencephalon. The floor of the metencephalon becomes a part of the brain we know as the pons, P-O-N-S. And then finally, the last segment down here is the myelencephalon. That we know as the medulla, sometimes called medulla oblongata, the medulla portion of the brain. So these are your 5 primary embryonic brain regions coming from their 5 neuromeres: telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon. Next, we'll look at the more mature brain structure and how that relates to this image here. All right, here's the more well-formed brain, more advanced shape of the brain. We saw this is a sagittal cut through the brain, through the middle. Before we saw the 5 segments of the brain, and here we have color-coded view of those 5 segments. First of all, we have the cerebral hemispheres up here that are in this first part. Cerebral hemispheres. Then we have this region that came from diencephalon underneath here. It includes the region we know as hypothalamus. The hypothalamus of the brain. This little circle in the middle here represents the thalamus of the brain. And then back over here we have the epithalamus or pineal gland there. So those are all parts of diencephalon. The next section of the brain down here would be the midbrain portion or mesencephalon. The mesencephalon includes actually there are 4 bumps on the dorsal side of the brain right here. The upper 2 bumps are called the superior colliculi and the lower one's the inferior colliculi. So I'm just going to label this superior and inferior colliculi. Those structures have to do with reflexes, having reflexive responses to visual cues and auditory cues. The upper pair of colliculi, those bumps up there, give you reflexive responses to visual cues, and then the lower pair give reflexive responses to auditory cues. All right, the next segment through here is derived from the metencephalon. It includes the cerebellum and the pons. Cerebellum and pons. Cerebellum is the part of the brain that helps you do coordinated movements, including walking, all kinds of sports events that you might be involved in, athletic things, playing an instrument, those kinds of coordinated activities. When you write, you use an instrument to write, you're using your cerebellum to coordinate those movements that bring about fairly routine and familiar motor activities. And then finally, the last part of the brain here is the medulla. derived from the myelencephalon. So, cerebral hemispheres from telencephalon, thalamus, hypothalamus, and pineal from the diencephalon, superior and inferior colliculi from the mesencephalon, cerebellum and pons from the metencephalon, and then finally from the myelencephalon you have your medulla. In there. So those are the major brain regions and parts and their origins based on their embryonic neuromere position. Now we're going to turn our attention to these cavities that form inside this 5-neuromere brain. Remember, this cavity on the inside is called the neurocele. The neurocele. In that neurocele, we're going to maintain an open space during our brain development. So we have a fluid-filled chamber that extends through all of this part of the brain, even into the adult brain. First of all, these two lateral chambers in your telencephalon portion here, these are ventricles 1 and 2. Sometimes simply called lateral ventricles of the brain. Lateral ventricles of the brain. Eventually, this ventricle 2 this ventricle on this side and this ventricle on this side will become completely separated down the middle, and each will have their own connection to the third ventricle. Third ventricle of the brain, which surrounds the diencephalon there, which is found in the diencephalon, surrounds the thalamus of the brain. The next section does not become a ventricle, but becomes a narrow tube that joins the third and fourth ventricle, and we call that the cerebral aqueduct. The tubular connection between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. Better indicate that over here. Here. Now, after the fourth ventricle, this tube narrows into what will become the central canal of the spinal cord. Central canal. There. So, lateral ventricles from the telencephalon, third ventricle from the diencephalon surrounds the thalamus. Through the midbrain portion, underneath the superior and inferior colliculus, we have the cerebral aqueduct, a tubular portion that will go through to the fourth ventricle, which lies basically underneath of the cerebellum in there, the fourth ventricle. And then beyond the fourth ventricle, it narrows, it's kind of a funneling into that narrow central canal that continues on through the spinal cord down there. Now let's look at these ventricles in the view of the brain in a more advanced state. Okay, now we need to look at the ventricles in this view of the brain. We already had labels on all this. So let's talk about that chambers, that hollow cavity that extends up through the brain here. First of all, our lateral ventricles, there's a left and right lateral ventricle, and I'm just going to kind of cover some of my words here with the illustration. These are the lateral ventricles of the brain. They have kind of an odd shape that kind of loops around. It's a little hard to appreciate in a two-dimensional picture, but they would be one on one side of the brain, one on the other. This odd-shaped structure. Kind of has a tail that comes around, and it kind of goes back toward the middle a little bit, so it's closer right through here, and then it goes back toward the middle there. So you have these in either cerebral hemisphere, on the left and on the right, you have your ventricles, your lateral ventricles. They are connected through a pore, pretty much like right about there. It's an opening, a gap, that leads into the third ventricle. So the third ventricle would be right through here and surround that thalamus right there. It's kind of almost donut-like shape. It makes a ring, and it's very narrow in its width, left to right. Forms kind of a disc around that thalamus in the middle there. So the left and right sides of the thalamus are pressed together right there where that circle is. So that's the third ventricle. And remember, from the third ventricle, there's a narrow passageway, a tubular passageway that goes from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle down here. So this space underneath the cerebellum is the fourth ventricle right there, and then it narrows down into that central canal of the spinal cord. So this is central canal in the medulla and spinal cord here. Parts of the old myelencephalon. In the metencephalon region, we have the fourth ventricle. Fourth ventricle. This is the cerebral aqueduct right here. Cerebral aqueduct. This is the third ventricle that makes that circle. And then we have our lateral ventricles. They would be side by side. There would be one on one side, one on the other. If I could make a dotted line to kind of represent one being over there on the other side. Something like that. So anyway, these are the ventricles of the brain. These are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Next, we need to talk about where cerebrospinal fluid comes from. In the roof of the lateral ventricles, left and right lateral ventricles, and in the roof of the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle are special vascular structures that produce cerebrospinal fluid. And that's what we need to talk about next. Okay, in this picture here, we've got a couple of things going on. First of all, in this upper part here, if we make a cut through the brain, a frontal section of the brain, so the front of the brain would be back here, the back of the brain in the back, and we cut through the two lateral ventricles of the cerebral hemispheres up in here, we'd have this fluid-filled space on either side. Those are the two ventricles of the brain in the cerebral hemispheres. In the roof of each ventricle, we have small vascular structures that produce cerebrospinal fluid. These are called choroid plexuses. And down here below, I've tried to enlarge that a little bit just to give some representation of what goes on here with a single choroid plexus. So this here represents a choroid plexus. Right here, this structure. In there are blood vessels indicated by the red lines in there, and cerebrospinal fluid is a fluid that comes out of the vessels through the membrane that lines the ventricle of the brain here, which is actually, those are ependymal cells, if you'll remember those. So it passes through the wall of the vessel, through the connective tissue, and through the ependymal cells. So it's kind of a highly processed fluid. It's not just any old fluid that's coming out there. It's been kind of selectively secreted into the space. But anyway, that fluid moving out there, we often abbreviate it CSF, but that stands for cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid being produced by the choroid plexus in the roof of the ventricles here. Now, it's produced in the two ventricles, the lateral brain hemispheres. It's produced in the third ventricle above the thalamus of the brain. It's produced in the fourth ventricle below the cerebellum. So we're producing fluid in all of those spaces. And it travels from the upper chambers through down to the third ventricle. What's produced in the third ventricle is added to that fluid, and then it's moved down the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. And there are more, there's another choroid plexus structure in the roof of the fourth ventricle of the brain that contributes even more cerebrospinal fluid. So all that cerebrospinal fluid that's being produced has to have a place to exit the brain. And let's look at our other picture here a minute. In this view of the brain we had a minute ago, we were looking at the lateral ventricles, third ventricle, fourth ventricle here, and we just talked about the existence of the choroid plexus and the roof of each of those ventricles of the brain. They produce more cerebrospinal fluid, but it has to exit somewhere. Now there's a point here and a point on either side beside the cerebellum, the base of the cerebellum, where that fluid exits, and another location down behind, right in the middle of the roof of the fourth ventricle where fluid will exit. These pores are referred to as apertures. There are two lateral apertures. One on either side of the base of the cerebellum, and then one behind the cerebellum called a median aperture. Probably should be called medial aperture. Two lateral apertures, one medial aperture, exiting from that space of the fourth ventricle. So we produce cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles, passes through all these chambers. Some of it goes down the central canal, but the excess is leaving that space and going into a space that surrounds the brain. We sometimes call a subdural or a subarachnoid space, and that's what we'll talk about next. Okay, this represents the surface of the brain right here with some membranes to the outside of the brain. So the golden color I have along there represents the brain surface. Along that there's a thin layer of green I've drawn in the picture. That thin layer of green represents something we call the pia mater. The pia mater in green. There's the pia mater. A very thin layer of cells on the surface, the outer surface of the brain. The space just above that pia mater is filled with that cerebrospinal fluid. So there's cerebrospinal fluid in here. CSF, I'll just write that in there, cerebrospinal fluid. To the most outside layer of membrane on here is represented by this brown line, and that's called the dura mater. Dura mater. It's a very tough layer of connective tissue. Unlike that pia mater, that's very thin and fragile, very transparent layer that lies right on the surface of the brain. Very much like a peritoneal covering or a visceral pleura would lie on the surface of an organ. That pia mater lies right on the surface of the brain. Then you have that fluid space. Then you have a very dense connective tissue, a very tough layer of connective tissue lying outside the brain and the cerebrospinal fluid there. Underneath the dura mater in here, I'll draw the arachnoid layer. The arachnoid layer, when you think arachnids, you think spiders, so this is like spider webs. This layer right in here, it's given its own name though, even though it's just kind of a loose connection of webby tissue through here. The arachnoid layer. Arachnoid layer. So those three parts make up what we call meninges. The three meninges, the dura mater, the arachnoid layer, and the pia mater. I've already mentioned that the cerebrospinal fluid fills that space there, and we often refer to that space between the dura mater and the pia mater in here that has that fluid in it. Sometimes it's called the subdural space. and sometimes it's called the subarachnoid space. It's definitely subdural, but the fluid kind of mixes with that webby layer in there, so either name might be used to indicate that fluid-filled space that lies just to the outside of the brain, filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now, it is in that space that the fluid is going to be reabsorbed. Remember, it's continually being produced in the ventricles of the brain. It leaves through the median aperture and the two lateral apertures below the cerebellum to add fluid to this space that's outside of the brain and spinal cord, but it has to be reabsorbed somehow. And there are some vascular structures extending down from the dura mater in here, and these are referred to as arachnoid villi. So I'm going to try to label that one right there in the middle as an arachnoid villus. Arachnoid villus. Vascular structures that reabsorb cerebrospinal fluid, that take it back out of that subdural space. There. So you should know your three meninges. You should know that cerebrospinal fluid fills that space under the dura mater and outside of the pia mater, and that the arachnoid villi are structures that reabsorb cerebrospinal fluid.